For coming along to this panel today, a discussion how we can learn and act for real progress in fire safety. My name is Charles Devenish, I'm the Managing Director of Adexon Fire and Smoke Curtains. Our mission statement is to redefine the performance of fire curtains, which some of you may be familiar with. I'm glad to be joined today by some leaders, thought leaders in the industry. Some of them, or maybe all of them, don't need an introduction, but they'll run through that. And then David is going to take the conversation away, and he'll be joined by Paul. We're then going to have 4 preset questions for the panel to answer, and then we'll hopefully have some time at the end for questions and answers. So, Andrea, if you can introduce yourself, please.
Yeah. Hello, everybody. I'm Andrea White, and I'm a fire engineer and a fire risk assessor with my own consultancy, and I'm also the founder of Women Talking Fire.
Thanks, Andrea. I'm from McSoley. I work for my own company. I've worked for many Tier 1 contractors over the last 30 years. I'm a chartered engineer. I'm the Vice Chair of CIBSE Fire. I do stuff for public health for CIBSE as well. And yeah, I'm here today to hopefully give some good points of views. Thanks.
Hello everyone, I'm Kizzy Augustin. I'm a partner at London Law firm Mishcon and Reya, and head of our health and safety team, dealing with the majority of construction and real estate clients, and I'd say 60% of my work at the moment is BSA related.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is David Savage. I'm a construction lawyer with Charles Russell Speechlys. That's an international law firm based here in London, and I lead a team of 40 construction lawyers, many of whom are working on Grenfell-related work.
Good afternoon. My name is Paul Morrell. I used to be the government's chief construction advisor, principally because I was the government's only construction advisor, and more recently have produced a review into the product testing regime in the UK, which is currently lurking in a dusty corner somewhere in MHCLG.
Thank you very much, everyone. David, if you could take us away, set the scene for us where we are now.
Sure. Well, it's great to be with you all, and I hope you're enjoying London Build. What I'm going to do is just take about 5 minutes in total to quickly set the scene for where I think we are in terms of where we may be going in regulating fire safety. And I want to do that, obviously, in the context of Grenfell as a project, and in particular, more recently, the publication of the Grenfell Phase 2 report with its 58 recommendations. I'm not going to go through all 58, don't worry. But I do want to say something about the background context and some of those recommendations. I'm not going to make a detailed comment on whether I think they're good or bad, the recommendations, but having alluded to some of them, I'm going to hand over to Paul, who will give us his view on, frankly, what should be taken forward and perhaps what shouldn't be taken forward. But let me start by reading something that I wrote on the morning of the publication of the Grenfell Phase 2 report to set the scene about what's been going on in the Grenfell context. I wrote the following: ultimately, as everyone has now had 7 years to consider and appreciate, the refurbishment of Grenfell Tower was not a uniquely bad project with an awful and tragic set of unpredictable consequences. Rather, it was an all-too typical project for its level of value, procured on the same flawed basis of construction economics and pressures that are still recognisable everywhere, and discharged against a backdrop of regulatory confusion, obfuscation, and failures that stretch back literally decades. Its horrific and tragic outcome was utterly predictable, and indeed was so predicted in astonishingly prescient terms, by the residents of Grenfell Tower itself, by a number of campaigning journalists and architects, by the House of Commons all-party parliamentary group on fire safety, and also by some of those directly likely to be implicated by the Phase 2 inquiry. As the inquiry hearings demonstrated forensically and viscerally, and to eviscerating effect, virtually no one came to the table with clean hands. How the inquiry has grappled with the Grenfell web of blame and the legal complexity of the interfaces between construction product development, that product's marketing and certification, design, construction, supervision, and sign-off of work will be poured over by many of us later today and for many days to come. The single enormous tragedy of Grenfell set in motion 3 different crises in my view. There was a crisis of building regulation. How did dangerous cladding end up on thousands of buildings in a major Western European country and indeed around the world? A crisis of law. Why were the most innocent of people, leaseholders of flats, impacted by dangerous cladding, being asked to foot the bill for remediation for so long before politicians ultimately responded to change the law? And there was also a crisis of ethics. How could the construction industry raise its standards, avoid a race to the bottom, and build a culture that delivers a product that is safe, not riddled with latent defects, sustainable, and something of which all project participants could be proud to have created? That's the background of Grenfell. Obviously, since Grenfell, we've had the Fire Safety Act, we've had the Building Safety Act. These are significant, and in the case of the BSA, very significant pieces of legislation. 264-page long act, doing multiple things simultaneously. We've had lots of statutory instruments to switch on most of the provisions of that act. And now we've had Grenfell Phase 2, which suggests that maybe the Building Safety Act hasn't gone far enough in all sorts of ways, including the definition of high-risk buildings, including the drafting of approved document B, whether there should be specific licensing of contractors involved in the development of higher-risk buildings, statutory protection of the term fire engineer, question marks over whether approved inspectors or indeed even local authority building control should continue to exist in the future, and numerous other recommendations. And we're now at that moment where the industry has to resolve with government what is going to be taken forward from those recommendations and what, quite frankly, is overreach or simply not going to help improve the position so far as not just fire safety, but building safety and building regulation more broadly. So that's the context in which we meet this afternoon. I'll say a little bit on some of the other subjects later on, but at this point I want to hand over to Paul to ask him what's sensible in Grenfell Phase 2 recommendations, what should be taken forward, and what, frankly, do you think won't help and therefore should be quietly dropped?
No, thank you, Dave. A great introduction. I might jump quite quickly to the things that should be dropped. There's a lot in it that's non-controversial, I think, and we can just sign off, and I think that will be the case. You use the expression overreach. I would just use practicality, and I think there are 2 categories of recommendations which I would say, and have said to the department, I think are misguided. And by the way, there's a problem if you say anything about Grenfell, that it shows a lack of respect for those who suffered the consequences of that fire, or some sympathy for those who caused it, and I feel neither of those things. But we need to be realistic about it. It's not about proportionality, that would be a wicked word to use in the context of simply 2 people dying, but what will work. And I think there are 2 categories of things which are wrong in principle, and which could prove to be a massive displacement activity. The first one is all the reorganisation of government and the reorganisation of the regulator. So they're recommending, for example, that all the responsibilities for fire get brought into a single department. Well, it's been done before. In Nick Wainsford's day, let's remember with respect, fire was suddenly brought into DCLG, as it was called then, or Office of Deputy Prime Minister, and it's gone out again. So it doesn't actually solve it. However you draw that circle around machineries of government, there'll always be something just outside it, and somebody ambitious will say you should bring within it. And it's a habit in any review, isn't it? Anything that is centralised, you recommend it gets devolved. And anything that's devolved, you recommend it gets centralised, and you've only done your job. I don't think that will solve anything, apart from the fact that a massive amount of time will get taken redesigning logos and moving people around. And of course, the vast majority of them anyway are working or shirking from home. So they're not going to be working together anyway. So I think that's a matter of communication and protocol. Similarly, the idea of having an Uber regulator, I think, is actually, at first blush, quite a sensible idea, but actually naive, because bringing construction product regulator into the building safety regulator means you've left all the regulation of other products, presumably outside that net. So once again, you draw a circle that only picks up part of the problem. Some products sell into more than one industry, and adhesives and paint and so on are not just a construction product. Some companies work across, some manufacturers work across sectors. Some aspects of regulating a product are common across all products, and you lose all of that. So I'm pretty sure if we had an Uber regulation that included product regulation, at some stage in the future, somebody will say, why don't we take construction product regulation and put that in the regulation of all other products, and we'll play that game again. What does need to happen, however, is something to bridge the gap between a product on the shelf and a product in its final use. I think that's a matter of communication and continuity of regulation, and I think it is the regulator's job, although Parliament may need to tell them it's their job, to find a way of working together to make sure that a product's followed through the whole of its life, because a failing product really only demonstrated when it's in its final use. And the idea of safety critical products we might talk about, but actually no such thing on its own. The other category, just quickly, that I think is a mistake, is the extent to which the burden is shifted away from responsibility in the industry to responsibility on the regulator or the government side. And I think this is a huge issue for government. The idea, for example, that the regulator should be responsible for product testing, I'm not sure I know what that means, but I'm pretty damn sure it would be a mistake. They're not caring with what they've got now. And it was start to change the burden of responsibility away from where I think it should be. So I think government's job is to be absolutely clear what the duties are on various duty holders across the business of making a building. So we've got a pretty good start, I would say, and it's starting to work around here. People are aware the world has changed. A pretty good start in terms of designers and contractors and building operators, accountable persons. They've got a lot of work to do, but the first thing is be clear. Nothing has happened in 7 years on the regulation of construction products apart from importing the EU system. And by the way, the terms of reference that I was given was to review the UK system of testing construction products for safety, and probably an unpopular conclusion is there's actually no such thing in the UK. There's not just this, there's an EU system for testing products against a set of standards used in terms of trade. So I think set the duty. Government should tell people, for some things, we require you to demonstrate that you complied with that duty, and prescriptive measures of compliance, maybe for those things that might kill people, and issue guidance if it wants to. But then the industry can take it away and say, we now have to take reasonable steps to comply with this obligation. And we work out between ourselves what reasonable steps means. It's a big word in law, isn't it? Reasonable. It carries a lot of weight. I think any attempt by civil servants to predict exactly where that might finish up is still wrong. And if there's somebody in government who knows what safe means, I've not met them yet.
Thank you very much, Paul and David. I'm sure everyone found that very insightful. I certainly did. We're going to jump into our first question, which is, are current regulations enough to ensure fire safety post phase 2 report? Who would like to take that away? Thanks,
Okay,
Andrea.
I'll start. So on LinkedIn, I've been quite vocal, and I've said that I think the current regulations are potentially a sledgehammer to crack a nut. As a practicing fire risk assessor and a fire engineer, I struggle with the amount of legislation and the amount of associated guidance, and I know our clients have even less idea. They can't even tell me the name of the document they want from me. So yeah, sledgehammer to crack a nut. The idea of any more regulation, quite frankly, fills me with dread. I think we're just going to tie ourselves up in knots. I did hear a podcast last week from Dame Judith Hackett in which she suggested that approved document B needs rewriting. Now, I don't disagree with that, but what she was saying was that industry should do it, and that fills me with dread too. Because I think what that actually means is that within government we don't have anyone who has sufficient understanding to write what we would call the linear route to compliance, the basic route to compliance. And I don't think we've got that in the BSR. So yeah, there's my response to more regulation. Perhaps not.
Very good. Anybody else want to answer that?
Well, yeah, I'm not speaking on behalf of all lawyers, but you would think that perhaps more regulation, more legislation would be welcomed by the legal fraternity, sorority. The difficulty that we've had, certainly we've seen from clients, is very much in line with what Andrea said, is that we just about got to grips with the phase one fallout and the recommendations and the legislation guidance that came from that. We now have potentially 58 or maybe slightly less recommendations that in some shape or form will be implemented into some sort of legislative framework. Clients of mine are struggling still with the BSA, let alone the BSR. And it's really, really difficult for them to start off at the basic level of, are we a duty holder or not? Do we have to take on these responsibilities? If we do, when do we have to take them on? So we're just about managing to deal with that. And you've got this overlapping issue of having a regulator, a new regulator. You know, we've had about 3, 4, 5 other regulators that you've had to deal with in building safety, construction and fire safety anyway. So this is another regulator that you now have to grapple with, who, as far as I'm concerned, doesn't necessarily have to be held to the same accountability as other duty holders. So there are a lot of difficulties right now in terms of the level of regulation that we have, the suggestion that we should have more, and the failure to understand what all of this legislation means. So I don't think the answer is more legislation. I think the answer is better understanding of what we've got.
Very good.
And do you know what? I'm thanks for letting me go last. This has been really insightful. And I think, Paul, you said something earlier that really struck a tone in us. And I don't think people really understand what reasonably safe is. And this all comes down to Regulation 8. Reasonable levels of safety and health for people and amongst buildings or who are affected by them. And when you look at things like, from in those Regulation 7, it's about how you get to adequate and appropriate systems. And I think, you know, it's adequate for the function, which it's designed to do, in a workmanlike manner. It's installed in a way where it does what it says on the tin. And I think when you look at, you know, this question of the need for more legislation, the hardest bit is that you can legislate people as much as you want, but we still need to be able to get to those appropriate solutions. We need to get more competent and better to get there. And I think with what's gone on in my career personally over the last 20 years, and CPR was a big part of my career, though I'll be honest, I don't think I really appreciated CPR, Construction Product Regulations, when it came in, and what the products meant in product language. And I said a bit about this today, is that the language around getting to appropriate products in the appropriate language to prove your condition is safe is actually quite difficult. And for me, that is where part of this issue lies. It's actually, when you look at the recommendations, you've got to get into the right language about not just reaction to fire a product, but resistance to fire, resistance to smoke spread, all the performance criteria, and how that's used to protect people in buildings.
I'm just going to say that tacks on to the idea of not just better language, but more of a culture of how to deal with fire safety rather than just compliance levels.
Very good. Well,
Obviously, construction products, I would say, what regulation? We don't really have any new ones. And my fear is that there will be over-prescription. Well, I was doing a review, there was an article in the newspaper about a new kind of insulation made out of popcorn. And having decided, check it wasn't April the 1st, which it wasn't, it made me realise that you could never legislate for every circumstance within the country. You can't do it. What you have to go back to general tests of what safety means. And I've now written to 4 building safety ministers in 3 years, just to say, look, if you just made an announcement, you're minded to base policy on the twin concepts of a general safety requirement. It must be uncontroversial that the product should be safe. Work out what that means later. And secondly, the concept of safety criticality, this could be relevant to proportionality. In other words, every product should be safe. Products that might kill you should be seen to be safe. If you just set that duty down and tell the industry, but we need to work out between us what that means. You know, it might be an unsatisfactory line from a policy point of view. It's the reality of what has to happen. So that has to be the next move to my mind. This will be the duty bearing down on manufacturers and those who market and sell and import goods. You know, and you have a defence of due diligence. You use due diligence to make a safe product. And that will become existential risk importance. Far more powerful in my view in culture, by the way. But if you are caught out by this, it will be existential risk to your business. You'll get business's attention, amongst all the other stuff that's coming along with the other stuff. So just start with that. But don't start trying to legislate for how you prove popcorn is safe.
Very good. David, do you want to add anything on this point? Or
No, I think that's been comprehensively addressed.
Very good. Let's move on to the next question is, what does competence mean in fire safety today? Who would like to take that away?
Well, I'll happily go legal on you just for a moment in terms of competence. So competence is the language of the new duty holder regime. So principal designer, principal contractor, the client, and so forth, which many of us are obviously familiar with because of CDM regs, which uses the same duty holder descriptions as the new duties, and it's really important to understand that this isn't a change to CDM regs. This is an entirely new set of duties coming out of the Building Safety Act 2022. So the competency requirements apply to both individuals and to organisations. They're expressed a little differently. So for individuals, the competency requirements relate to the skills, knowledge, experience and behaviours, and I emphasise and behaviours. Goes back to my opening remarks about ethics in the sector and indeed the construction product manufacturers in particular perhaps. For organisations, competency requirements relate to the terminology as the organisational capability. That is the ability of an organisation to carry out its functions under the building regulations properly, and that includes having in place appropriate management systems, processes and policies to carry out those functions, and having the capability to ensure that the organisation's staff have, and then it reverts back to the language of what individual competency is all about, skills, knowledge, experience, and behaviours. Anyone who appoints anybody to carry out design or building work must take, and here's the language, it's that word reasonable again, quote, all reasonable steps to ensure that those they appoint meet the competency requirements for their roles. Those roles are set out in particular regulations. Reasonable steps, and this comes back to the proportionality point. I mean, the one thing we could all agree that risk is a function of. It's a function of the probability of something happening and the consequences of something happening. So, that's what the risk matrix looks like. And SAFE always needs to acknowledge those two components and the compound effect of those components. So if something's very unlikely to be catastrophic, but if it manifested itself, it was catastrophic, the management of that risk has to be of a particular profile and approach, which may be different to something else which is much more likely but much less catastrophic in terms of its impact. And by the way, I should say at that point, one completely gratuitous piece of advice to everybody here, at least we are getting on with replacing problem cladding in this country. We may not be doing it as fast as the politicians would like us to be doing it, but we are doing it. And there are plenty of places in the world where these products are not being replaced. And, I won't name those jurisdictions, but I can tell you that there are many parts of the world where, a particular hotel has been clad in a particular way. I'm asking for a room in one of the lower floors, frankly. So let's leave it there for the time being. There's a lot of, one thing law firms are brilliant at doing is writing free guidance notes, and they put them on their websites, and you can sign up to their marketing literature, and, contrary to popular opinion, we actually give away quite a lot of free law. Connect with me on LinkedIn. I write about this stuff all the time.
Thanks a lot, David. Anybody else on competence?
I'll make a comment which is slightly different to David's kind of legal analysis. I think the practicality of what competence looks like and what good looks like has really been borne out in how you adopt the associated guidance with that. So a lot of clients will say, how do I demonstrate competence? How do I demonstrate the skills, the knowledge, experience, the capability, etc., the cultures? And what we're finding is the regulators probably would be satisfied with looking at things in the format of a register that incorporates the PAS document. And I find, I mean, the 867.1, 2 and 3, if you are responsible for fire, they're useful documents, I think, to look at. They're quite lengthy and detailed, but if you can incorporate some of the existing guidance into your approach, into your systems, there's an expectation that this is the way you will establish and assess risk. It's much more than your typical risk assessment, but it's much more about incorporating what the government expects you to adhere to in terms of your general approach to fire safety and building safety. So I think if you use that as a starting point, then you will be able to build upon that when it comes to looking at what good looks like. None of us really have those answers. None of us on this panel have those answers. I think that will be borne out when we start seeing test cases. And definitely that will come. I'm under no illusion of that, but I think once we start seeing perhaps the regulator really cut its teeth in terms of criminal liability and a failure to either meet the regulations or the Act or meet competency requirements, that's when we'll be able to tell you in a bit more detail what good looks like.
Can I jump in?
Of course you can, yeah.
So I'll talk as a fire engineer, as a fire risk assessor, and as an expert witness for the courts. And I'd say at the moment about half of my fee-earning work is reviewing issues with other fire safety professionals' work. I recently wrote an article for the ASFP's magazine, and the title was Mind the Gap, because over my career we've built more complicated buildings, and our knowledge as fire safety professionals has not kept pace with that. And so the gap has widened. If anything, our knowledge, in my view, as an industry whole, has rather significantly reduced. And that leaves a huge, huge gap. I think there are ways to demonstrate competence. There is third-party accreditation, there's professional registration. So I'm an incorporated engineer by the AIFiRE, through the Engineering Council and through CABE, and I'm third-party accredited as a fire risk assessor with the AIFiRE. That is one way to demonstrate. What I would say though is that those accreditation schemes, in my humble opinion, having been an interviewer and overseeing some of that, is that I would severely question whether those levels, in order to achieve those accreditations, are enough. My view is that's a really big question we should be asking ourselves. And I would also say that in terms of competence, I've tried quite hard to press the BSR in terms of their competence. And at the moment I'm being stonewalled. My interpretation of that is that they don't answer because they don't want to tell me what I think I am going to hear. I think we are talking about mandatory fire risk assessor registration, accreditation. Government are now talking about that, so you will, at some point in the future, if you're a fire risk assessor, you will have to be on a register of some kind. And the Phase 2 report did the same for fire engineers. Whether that actually comes to fruition or not, I question, simply because of numbers. There are not enough fire engineers. There's too many that are going to retire, and there are not enough coming through to replace them, and we don't have enough already. So I suspect that that's more of a difficult question in terms of competence and demonstrating competence for fire engineers. But I do think we need to be asking whether the standards of those demonstrations of competence are good enough.
Very good, thank you, Andrea. Going to move on to the third question: is how do we ensure consistency across multiple regulatory bodies? Who would like to take that one away? How do we ensure consistency across multiple regulatory bodies?
Well, I think what I'll do is quickly as well, just to add to the last point, and it actually fits in nicely with this as well. And I think Andrea's point here on fire engineers is really true. And also, I think one of the big things around products is, I'm not sure fire engineers, if you ask them about any fire particular product on the market, they know all the attributes of it. I think you'd agree with that, Andrea, because I think when you've got fire in your title, not that I'm a fire engineer, I am AIFiRE, but I am building services that does products more than anything. It doesn't mean I understand every single product on the market, which is part of the issue around the competency circle. So when you look at all the different regulatory bodies that exist, and there'll be people here much more experienced in dealing with them than I am. I've had some dealings with them. But one of the big problems I think we're facing is that these products are actually very complicated. They're not simple. And I'm not sure we've actually got a full appreciation yet how hard it is to get to that appropriate product. I think as Paul said earlier, and David, the reasonable approach to safety and health by the right product to get you there. How easy it's going to be to get there for us. When you look at the cost regulations and regulators that you've got to be fair to them as well. They've got the same conundrum. There's not a product standard for everything. Does everything need a product standard? This all comes down to safety critical and general product safety 2007. And it's very difficult to look at these products and say, which ones do we need a standard for, which ones don't we, which ones should just be good old-fashioned, competent engineering. You have things in the industry around breakaway connections, tech screws on fire dampers, and you go, well, actually it's a thermal expansion problem. The tech screws are irrelevant. It's actually, will the damper get pushed out the wall? What's the right connection? But there's not actually guidance around it. Because it used to be just engineering, if that makes sense. I'm going to pass on to Kizzy.
Thanks. Pass it on. How do we ensure consistency? I think there's a few things, and it's bringing in some of the themes that we've already talked about. I think just a general approach, like we used to, it's back to, I'd say back to basics. It's that kind of cooperation, collaboration, communication, engagement approach that we used to have, I'd say back in the old days, I'm not old enough, but back in the old days of the beginnings of CEng, where people were encouraged to work together. And I think that was one of the aims of the BSA, is to ensure that the duty holders involved within the supply chain are working together a lot more effectively and efficiently. And that's great, but what's not happening is enough of that. So I think if we were doing a bit more of the talking to each other, sharing of information, you know, all the things that BSA has now generated, like the golden thread, like mandatory occurrence reporting, all of that, all I think is generated towards us being much more of a collaborative sector. That being said, I think where I'm finding lots of inconsistency is the fact that we have overlapping regimes. So BSA isn't the start of building safety. In fact, we had very well-established regimes that touched on building and fire safety, like the health and safety regime governed by the HSE, fire safety regime governed by the fire authorities, local authorities being involved, environment agencies being involved and understanding, you know, concepts of building. So there's lots of regulators. I deal with a lot of them. I'm probably not their best fan, but you know, we all do want to work together to ensure that the buildings that we build and occupy are safe. So I think where there's a lot of inconsistencies, it's not the duty holders per se not talking to each other, it's the regulators not talking to each other. And that's where we're at the moment. BSR isn't heavily involved with the existing regulators that we have in the UK. And I think if they were talking to each other a lot more, and maybe if we were going towards this idea of an Uber regulator, if there was a requirement that all the sub-regulators underneath talk to each other, we might be in a better position. Perhaps I wouldn't be as fearful of what's to come as I am now.
I'm not a pure health and safety specialist like Kizzy, but I have read an awful lot of the history that preceded Grenfell. I want to read you just very quickly one quote. Class 0 material is not equivalent to a material of limited combustibility. A material of limited combustibility is usually a material that is either totally non-combustible or one that contains a small amount of combustible material. Combustible materials such as plastics are not materials of limited combustibility. They can achieve class 0 performance by adding fire retardants or covering them in metal foil. A combustible material can therefore achieve a Class 0 rating as defined by the regulations, yet still be added to a building whilst being a fire hazard. That's a true statement. That statement was issued in 1985 by the UK Fire Brigades Union. So sometimes it's a question not of how do we unify standards and communications, it's a question of have we been listening in the first place?
That's very good. Very good. Yeah, no, it's a quote comes to mind that's been said is we could do it, really goes back to one of our earlier questions, that is we do it more enforcement rather than more regulation, just to actually what we've actually already got in place is actually then adhered to and followed.
We sometimes just have to remind ourselves what we already know,
yes.
And we have to see the wood from the trees.
Yeah, it's very good. Very good. We'll move into the final question. Is there a practical nature to implement the change proposed in the report and the other overlapping regimes from a client's point of view and any other point of views on the panel?
From an industry point of view, I think I've given the clue already. I think I'm convinced of the way forward is to be absolutely clear what the duties are in the first instance. That will also, by the way, ensure some consistency of regulatory behaviour, because what are they trying to regulate? And I think I talk quite a lot with BSS, with whom I'm impressed, by the way, who are pretty determined to get non-conforming products off the marketplace. They're not hiding behind the bush, trying to catch you speeding a bit over the limit. They're looking for somebody who's weaving down the road piss, and they want that guy off the road. Overstretch your analogies. So I think enforcement will start to work. I suppose one good positive bit of news is something I've been pushing for quite a long time and agreed that we would do with OPSS is what would due diligence look like in making a safe product? Because it's a complicated question. Once you start attacking things to each other, putting them into a building, things start degrading over time. What would reasonable skincare look like in making a safe product? I think the building blocks of it are fairly clear. Good pre-market risk assessment, a good testing and assessment process, a factory production control process that demonstrates that what you're making matches the standard that you're claiming for it, and then the strong communications, proper knowledge. I think CCPI is a huge contribution towards that. And if that duty of care was clearly understood, it will drive people towards those good habits. And then proper market surveillance, not by the authorities as part of it, but actually by the manufacturers themselves. Keep learning what's happening to your products. So if you learn, in a poignant example, that your cavity barriers are being put in back to front, improve the product so you can't put it in back to front. It'll be very clear in the documentation. I think that way of working is a 10-year project at best. But actually that, with the courts coming along behind, I spent the whole of my professional life working against an obligation to show reasonable skincare and professional skincare. So all that somebody has to do to get me in court is to find somebody else who does the same job that says, I let my client down. I think that environment will work much better than highly prescriptive, very detailed regulation of a kind of gotcha regulatory nature.
Very good.
It's a really interesting question. I think I would agree with a lot of what Paul has said. In fact, I think everything I've heard from Paul today. I think, as I said right at the very beginning, the critical junction is what is good to take forward from Grenfell Phase 2 and what should be dropped because it's either unrealistic or isn't going to help us make real progress. There is a wider question about the structuring and delivery of construction projects under the sort of hierarchical and subcontracting-led model that we have, which wasn't always set up in quite the way that it is. I wrote a book 20 years ago on partnering and collaborative working. It's still on sale, it still sells, but I haven't seen enough of the change that I was advocating for in that book. We need to work out how to take oppositional, compounded risk, hierarchical relationships and somehow better align them. And there's got to be economic incentivization, of course there has. And don't blame the construction lawyers because we didn't create the industry in terms of its economic structures. Not everywhere in the world operates like we do, and there are a few parts of the world that we can look to for inspiration in that regard. But I've been waiting a long time for that buzz.
Thanks, David. There's some really good points here with this, and you are right about the construction. it does need to change. And I think the question is from a client's point of view. Yeah. So I've been a client. I've been tier 1 contractor several times. Part of the problem I think we have, it all comes down to this competency question as well. The competency to get to the right product language generally sits in supply chain or at product level. When you look at it from tier 1 contractors' point of view, and you look at it from designers' point of view, they can't necessarily get to that right language. So unless you bring people in earlier, but give them the platform, the resource to help the fire engineer, the architect, the building services engineer, the tier 1 contractor get to that right product level, it's very hard to get to that panacea where we'll get the change that we need. And that's why I think when you say, look, with the Latham report as well, isn't it, if we go back in time, we're all going for that right thing, but I think clients need to help in that respect of how procurement goes as well. We need to procure things slightly earlier to get to the right product system. And I think, Paul, you're right, I've had this conversation before, not to mention too much, but I did a diagram for you when I passed it across of how hard it was to get to one product. And when you looked at it, you sort of go, in hindsight, you're asking an architect or a fire engineer to decipher this thing, which is about, it's like this in A3, hundreds of lines across it for one product. So unless you've got the right supply chain in early enough, and we look at how that, when you said it earlier, culture and behaviour around how we're procuring to get to that right, appropriate, safe, reasonable system, it's not going to be that easy to implement all of those recommendations as a client. We still need to look at how we procure, and are we doing it in a way that enables designers and product manufacturers to speak the right language and get to that right product.
Very good. Kizzy, anything on that?
Yeah, I think I'd agree with everything said so far. I think on top of that is just this better understanding of what's out there. So maybe it is lawyers, maybe it is experts, maybe it is all of us. It's incumbent of all of us to share information because we all have a part to play when it comes to the safety of our buildings. And one thing that I think seems to escape a lot of clients in particular is this idea that it's not just about being sued for something going wrong and having defects and having to, rectify those. That, as important as that is, it's the overlapping criminal liability that attaches to that. The BSA talked about that heavily. We haven't had it tested yet, but I think we will. And it's understanding that there is criminal and civil responsibility and liability. This idea of accountability, I am actually in agreement with. I am in agreement with this idea of accountability that the BSA gives us. It's just about what level of accountability each party has, and I think it's really sensible to start as early as possible. I know that that's what the BSA wanted, is to make sure that we're starting way before we've built anything, and it's really about design and discussing safety from a design-led approach as opposed to waiting until something's built and then having to rectify. So I'm all for information sharing, this accountability piece. Let's understand what accountability means to each of us who play part in the supply chain.
And Kizzy, just to add, I think, David, you said this earlier, not to harp on it, sorry, I have a habit of talking. We're talking about risk earlier, likelihood, the rest of it. We are, and I think this is something I've observed, that risk has been passed to the most unusual suspects in construction contracts. And that's something, again, which comes down to procurement, where we don't end up with certain things in a project which have been built but not actually designed by anyone. That's something that's been going on as a consequence of that, and I think that's where you're at as well. I think we were saying there, Kizzy. Sorry to...
I was going to say, just before I pass on to Andrea for the kind of closing remarks, you just mentioned, Paul, about risk. I think we have to also remember that we're not just talking about actual defects or actual injuries here. Health and safety, fire safety, building safety is now firmly embedded in exposure to risk. And that's actually a very scary concept if you haven't come to grips with mitigation of risk when it comes to your buildings or your project.
Very good. Anything else on the panel before we move on to questions from the audience? Anyone carry a mic? We've got a few minutes if anyone's got a question. Thanks, Andrea.
It's a massive topic. I was a former building control surveyor before Grenfell, and then my private visiting on site was purely not enough for me to come sign up a job to say yes, this is okay. I then went on to go and work for a company, site management, Press Nicholson, and just find stuff like rubbish in the cavities, and then I'm like, okay, this is more bigger than we can ever imagine. When I say rubbish, like, general lunch is stuck into the wall cavities. So I suppose bringing it back to Grenfell, it's also complicated, just even for someone who's educated. The people that actually are putting these things together are not necessarily as educated as what one would need to be in order to put this together. When we look at Grenfell, I don't understand why it's so hard. It was originally built out of concrete, which is, from my understanding, please correct me, but non-combustible. So the problem was actually, we then put cladding on it by people that didn't know how to, and obviously various other parts. But the problem with Grenfell was the cladding, also the fact that we should take from it that the fact that it had only one fire escape. That was obviously not great. And maybe if we would have, if it could have been sprinkled, which could have been done at a later date, would have helped the situation. So surely don't we just go back to just to simplify things to make it more easier for everyone? Okay, maybe we should use concrete. I know it's not as efficient at the moment, and you lot might say, well, crystal, this is not. But let's just go back to the basics. Why are we not using concrete? How much people can get that wrong? And then find ways to work from the basis of something so simple as concrete, and then we add to it. Because I don't. It shouldn't be that difficult. None of it should. I don't get it. My perspective. I hope that makes sense. My question.
That's a good question, by the way. And I think one thing we did learn from Grenfell is it's not a very good idea to clad building with polymerised petrol. I think, and that solved a lot of the problem. The non-combustibility rule was probably overstated, but it's a pretty good start. And I think that's where you get into whether we're being disproportionate. But there will, as a consequence of other changes like sustainability, which is coming from Europe in a big way, whether we like it or not, there will be more and more innovation in how we make buildings. And I think therefore we need to have machinery, which is the kind we described at a high level. You can't launch an innovative product unless it complies with a certain series of tests and standards. And that has to be the way forward. So let me bring everything out of concrete. But what we knew, we've already referred to the car safety thing, which was, it was quite a strong recommendation in the way they were brought to 202. That should be changed, and it wasn't changed. So a regulatory alert, which is part of it. So it isn't that simple. It has to be simple and comprehensible. The other industry is not simple either. Making a safe car is not a simple process. And I think the idea that we might get this all to one side of A4 is probably not right. What needs to matter? I think construction will always be a relay race. We won't solve this with a massive new idea about procurement. What needs to be clear is the duties you own while you're holding the back. Duties of competence and compliance and so on. And then what has to happen when you hand it back moment so that the next person can fulfill their duties. So you don't need to know everything. You need to know somebody who does. And you need to know actually what your liability is at each point in the chain. And not imagine that somebody further back or further on will solve the problem.
In 2016, I spoke on a different panel. It was the Financial Times' Future Construction Conference. And I had recently bought a new car, happened to be a Volvo. And Volvo had recently put out a public statement that their aspiration for their brand was that nobody should die or suffer life-changing injuries in a Volvo car from 2020 onwards. And at the time that I was speaking, we had tragically suffered a number of fatalities from tower crane deaths. And I challenged everybody in the room. There were lots of contractors and clients and different participants in the industry. And I said, which of you would be willing to make that equivalent commitment publicly, that nobody in your organization would die or suffer a life-changing industry by virtue of what you do? And there was some awkward shuffling. And then I made this comment, and I said, and the problem is that all of us at this point, even if we're not saying it publicly, what we're thinking is, yes, David, but our industry is different, because construction isn't like car production in a controlled environment, and then we can just go off on a riff from there. And at one level, that's of course right. But the point is, you've got to start with a commitment, you've got to start with an aspiration, you've got to start with what your culture is. And that goes back to my point about ethics and about having an industry that everybody who participates in can be proud of the product and contribute to a better product going forward. And the example that you give, people putting rubbish into construction waste, this is part of the issue. You touched on something that is part of the issue here. We've got to be bolder, we've got to be more ambitious, and we've got to change the culture of our industry as well as all the technical issues we've been talking about today.
Thank you very much.